The Lexus RX 350 has one of the best reputations in the luxury SUV world, and that reputation did not appear by accident. For years, Americans have bought these things because they want something comfortable, quiet, upscale, and, more importantly, something that does not behave like a financial emergency every time the odometer adds another 20,000 miles. You regularly see older RX models still driving around Florida, Texas, California, New York, and practically everywhere else in the country. And that long-term durability is one of the reasons used RX 350 prices remain surprisingly strong. But reliability does not mean immunity. There are specific parts on specific generations that can turn one of the most dependable luxury SUVs in America into a very expensive repair if the owner does not recognize the warning signs. And number one on this list is especially important because Lexus itself launched a service campaign covering thousands of RX 350s after identifying a component that could begin leaking engine oil as it aged. So today, we are looking at 3 Lexus RX 350 parts every current owner and used buyer should know about, why they fail, which model years deserve the most attention, what symptoms appear first, and what can happen if you simply keep driving. If you own an RX 350, subscribe to VH Car before we start and tell me your model year and mileage in the comments. I especially want to see how many people watching are already above 150,000 or even 200,000 miles, because that is exactly where the Lexus reputation becomes much more interesting. And before anyone thinks we are saying every RX 350 is a ticking time bomb, that is not the point. The current 2026 RX 350, sold in the United States, uses a 275 horsepower turbocharged 2.4-liter four-cylinder and starts in the low $50,000 range, while the older RX 350 generations we are discussing used naturally aspirated 3.5-liter V6 engines. These are different vehicles with different drivetrains and different problem histories. Lexus currently lists the 2026 gas RX 350 at 275 horsepower, with front-wheel drive models rated at an estimated 22 city, 29 highway, and 25 mpg combined. So if you own a brand new RX, do not hear 2007 oil hose and immediately begin dismantling your engine in the driveway. This video is about understanding the RX 350 family over time and knowing which parts deserve additional scrutiny when buying an older example. Number 3. The oil pan sealing area on 2017 to 2022. RX 350's number 3 is one of those problems that can begin looking almost harmless. Oil seepage around the lower portion of the engine. Lexus issued an official technical tip in 2022 covering 2017 through 2022 RX 350 models after identifying that some vehicles could experience an engine oil leak from the number 2 oil pan. Lexus was specific enough about the issue that technicians were instructed to photograph the untouched leak before repairing it and contact Toyota's technical assistance system for guidance because the condition was under investigation. That does not mean every 2017 to 2022 RX leaks oil. It means the condition was common enough for Lexus technicians to receive an official diagnostic procedure for it, which makes it something a used buyer should absolutely inspect. This is where people make a very understandable mistake. They crawl underneath the SUV, see a little wetness around the engine and think, it is a Lexus, it is probably nothing. Sometimes it really is minor seepage. You may have a car that loses such a tiny amount between oil changes that the dipstick barely moves. But the problem with oil leaks is that what appears underneath the engine may not always tell you exactly where the oil started. Oil can travel downward, spread across surfaces, and make a lower component appear responsible when the real source is somewhere higher. That is why a proper diagnosis matters, instead of immediately paying someone to replace whichever gasket happens to look wet. The component itself is not necessarily what makes this repair scary. Sealant and an oil pan are not exotic pieces of hardware. Labor is the part that changes the equation. On modern transverse engine luxury crossovers, Access can turn what sounds like a basic sealing job into something far more involved. Depending on the exact location and severity, technicians may need substantially more disassembly than you would expect just from looking at the price of the gasket or sealant. That is a recurring lesson with the RX 350. Sometimes the $50 component is attached to a $1,500 labor bill. The warning signs are relatively straightforward. Look for fresh oil underneath the engine, oily residue accumulating around seams, drops appearing where the vehicle is normally parked, a burnt oil smell if fluid reaches hot components, or an oil level that begins dropping between services. If you are shopping for a used RX 350 from this generation, do not inspect it only while standing next to the salesman. Get underneath it. A pre-purchase inspection on a lift is worth dramatically more than another 10 minutes discussing the color of the leather. And here is another point that matters. A small oil seep is not automatically an emergency requiring you to tow the car home. The severity determines the response. A light film that has existed for years without measurable oil consumption is very different from fresh oil actively dripping onto the floor. But ignoring any leak indefinitely is a bad strategy. Engines require the correct oil level, and allowing a leak to progress until the engine operates low on oil can transform a manageable sealing repair into internal engine damage. If you own a 4th generation RX 350, especially a 2017 through 2022 model, tell me in the comments whether you have ever noticed oil underneath yours. Include the mileage when you first saw it and what the repair cost, because actual ownership information is extremely useful to somebody shopping for one today. And if this kind of mechanical breakdown is more useful to you than another video simply saying, Lexus is reliable, leave a like and subscribe to VHCar. There is a big difference between calling a vehicle reliable and understanding why it stays reliable when it is maintained correctly. Number 2. The water pump number 2 is the water pump. And this component is important because its job is so basic that people sometimes forget how destructive its failure can become. The water pump circulates coolant through the engine and cooling system. If it begins leaking, loses its bearing, stops moving coolant correctly, or deteriorates badly enough, engine temperature begins rising. Keep driving an overheating engine, and what began as a water pump replacement can eventually become cylinder head damage, head gasket problems, or, in the worst case, an engine that is no longer economically sensible to repair. RepairPal specifically warns that an RX 350 with a water pump that no longer maintains coolant circulation can overheat and ultimately suffer engine failure. This problem is especially interesting on the RX 350 because the pump itself is not necessarily extraordinarily expensive. Again, access and labor are what can hurt. Current RepairPal data places RX 350 water pump replacement around the 4-figure range depending on year, location, and labor rate, with a 2020 RX 350 repair estimate around $1,163 to $1,547. Other independent estimates show that certain RX generations can become even more expensive because of the amount of labor involved. Owner experiences illustrate just how much the labor side can vary. In a 2026 Club Lexus discussion, an owner of a 2020 RX 350 with approximately 119,000 miles reported that the water pump was not yet leaking but had begun producing a rattling noise. The Lexus dealer quote included roughly 11 hours of labor for water pump and thermostat replacement, while an independent shop quoted significantly less labor. That is one owner's example rather than a universal price. But it demonstrates why a seemingly ordinary cooling system component can become a surprisingly expensive maintenance event on this SUV. What should you watch for? Coolant residue near the pump area. Coolant disappearing from the reservoir without an obvious external explanation. Pink or colored crust around cooling system components depending on coolant type. A whining, grinding, or rattling noise from the pump bearing area. A sweet coolant smell. Temperature fluctuations, or the temperature gauge beginning to climb higher than normal. If the engine actually starts overheating, that is no longer the time to say, "I only have 20 more miles until home." Stop before the inexpensive failure becomes the expensive failure. And there is an important distinction between prevention and paranoia. I would not replace a perfectly functioning RX 350 water pump simply because somebody on the internet says theirs failed at 80,000 miles. That is not how responsible maintenance works. You inspect the system, monitor coolant level, investigate noise and leakage, and respond when there is evidence. Reliability does not come from randomly replacing half the vehicle. It comes from catching small mechanical changes before they become large ones. This is also one of the reasons service history matters so much on a used luxury SUV. Imagine two identical RX 350s sitting at two different dealerships. Same year, same trim, same color. Both have 120,000 miles. One has receipts documenting cooling system work, fresh coolant, a recently replaced water pump, and consistent maintenance. The other has nothing except a salesman telling you, "These Lexus engines last forever." Which one do you want? The first one, every time. If you have already replaced a water pump on an RX 350, put the model year, mileage, and total cost in the comments. I want to see how different dealership prices are from independent shop prices around the United States. And if you are planning to keep your RX beyond 100,000 miles, subscribe to VHCar because that long-term ownership stage is exactly where videos like this become more useful than a 5-minute new car review. But number 2 still is not the RX 350 component I would be most concerned about, because number 1 can lose something even more important than coolant. It can lose engine oil quickly. Number 1, the VVTi oil supply hose on certain 2007-2009. RX 350's number 1 is the VVTi oil supply hose. And unlike many common problem claims you hear online, this one has direct documentation from Lexus. The company created Limited Service Campaign 9LH for certain 2007, 2008, and 2009 Lexus RX 350s, equipped with the 2GR FE V6. Lexus stated that the rubber portion of the oil supply hose feeding the VVTi actuator could degrade over time and begin leaking. The company eventually extended the campaign, and the extension covered approximately 18,500 affected RX 350s in the United States. And the reason for the deterioration is unusually specific. Lexus explained that the rubber section could develop a pinhole, and that exposure over time to small amounts of corrosive gases from the positive crankcase ventilation system could cause that pinhole to expand. Once it expands, engine oil begins escaping from the hose. Lexus identified abnormal engine noise and the oil pressure warning light as possible indications that the problem had occurred. Now think about what that hose is carrying. Not windshield washer fluid, not air conditioning refrigerant, engine oil under pressure. If a coolant hose develops a tiny leak, you may smell coolant and notice the reservoir level falling slowly. If an engine oil supply hose ruptures badly enough, oil can leave the engine frighteningly quickly. And an engine that loses sufficient oil pressure does not care how good Lexus reliability rankings are. Bearings need lubrication. Camshafts need lubrication. The entire engine depends on a thin pressurized film of oil separating metal surfaces that absolutely should not be touching each other directly. This is the scenario that should concern any buyer looking at an early RX 350. The SUV can be beautifully maintained. The leather can look perfect. The transmission can shift smoothly. The engine can sound excellent during the test drive. But if the affected hose was never updated, you are carrying a known failure point that Lexus considered important enough to address through a service campaign. The good news is that this is not some mysterious internal engine defect requiring a complete teardown. Lexus's remedy was to replace the VVTi oil hose, and during the campaign, covered vehicles received the repair at no charge. The important question today, almost 20 years after the earliest affected RX 350s were produced, is whether the particular vehicle you are buying actually received the updated part. That is why documentation matters. If you are considering a 2007, 2008, or 2009 RX 350, check the VIN and service history, rather than relying on somebody telling you, "I think the previous owner did it." Evidence is better than memory. You want to know whether the service campaign was completed and what component is currently installed. Owner reports show why this issue became notorious. Car complaints includes an account from a 2008 RX 350 owner describing a burst oil line that resulted in severe engine damage after rapid oil loss. One report does not establish the failure rate of every RX, but it demonstrates the potential consequence Lexus was trying to prevent. When a pressurized engine oil hose fails, the difference between noticing immediately and continuing to drive can be the difference between replacing a hose and replacing an engine. This is also where I want to make something very clear. If your oil pressure warning appears while driving, do not treat it like the low fuel light. An oil pressure warning can indicate that the engine is not receiving the lubrication pressure it needs. Shut the engine down safely and determine the cause. 5 extra miles with insufficient oil pressure can cost dramatically more than a tow truck. And if you own a 2007 to 2009 RX 350 and have never checked whether this service was completed, that is probably the most useful thing you can take away from this entire video. Look at the records. Check the VIN. Inspect the hose. You do not need to panic, but you do need to know what is installed on your vehicle. If that information alone potentially saved somebody from buying the wrong RX 350, leave a like and subscribe to VHCar. And if you own one of these early cars, tell me whether yours received the VVTi hose replacement and how many miles it has today. I would not be surprised to see several of these vehicles in the comments with 200,000 miles or more, because the irony is that this engine can be extremely durable once known weak points are addressed. So, is the Lexus RX 350 actually unreliable? No. And that is probably the most important conclusion of the entire video. Finding 3 documented problem areas in a vehicle that has been sold for roughly 2 decades does not suddenly make it unreliable. In fact, part of the reason these issues stand out is precisely because the RX 350 developed such a strong durability reputation. A badly designed vehicle gives you a list with 30 things to fear. With the RX, the smarter conversation is usually about identifying which generation you are buying and understanding its specific weak points. If you are shopping for a 2007 to 2009 RX 350, confirm that the VVTi oil hose issue was addressed. Lexus's own campaign documentation gives us a clear reason to check it. If you are buying an older V6 RX in general, pay attention to the cooling system and water pump. A small coolant leak is much cheaper to solve than the overheating damage that can follow if it is ignored. If you are considering a 2017 to 2022 RX 350, inspect the engine carefully for oil seepage, particularly around the lower engine area, because Lexus itself documented possible No.2 oil pan leakage on those model years. And if you are shopping for a current 2026 RX 350, remember that this generation uses a completely different 2.4-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder powertrain. It is not technically responsible to take a problem from a 2008 3.5-liter V6 and pretend a brand new RX has the same defect simply because the badge says RX 350. That distinction is exactly what makes a good used car buyer different from somebody who spends 30 seconds searching Lexus RX problems and becomes terrified of every model year ever produced. The RX 350 can still be an excellent used luxury SUV. But the best used Lexus is not automatically the cheapest one, the lowest mileage one, or the one with the cleanest paint. It is the one whose previous owner understood maintenance, fixed known issues correctly, and kept enough documentation to prove it. A 140,000-mile Lexus that has been properly maintained can make far more sense than an 80,000-mile Lexus that spent its entire life surviving on delayed oil changes and optimism. So these are the 3 components I would pay special attention to. The oil pan sealing area on certain 2017 to 2022 vehicles, the water pump and cooling system as these SUVs accumulate mileage, and, most importantly, the VVTi oil supply hose on certain 2007 to 2009 RX 350s. Number 3 can make your driveway oily and your repair bill uncomfortable. Number 2 can overheat the engine if ignored. Number 1 can potentially dump the lubricant your engine depends on to survive. And that is why number 1 is the part I would verify before buying an early RX 350. Now I want the ownership side of this story. If you have an RX 350, put your year, mileage, and biggest repair so far in the comments. If yours has crossed 200,000 miles without a major mechanical failure, I especially want to hear about it, because those experiences are just as important as the failures. Subscribe to VHCar if you want more videos where we take cars with excellent reputations and identify the specific parts owners should still watch. And leave a like if you want another Lexus next, because the RX 350 has an excellent reputation. But no car is indestructible, and sometimes one small piece of rubber is all it takes to remind you of that.